Chapter 7 of Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. Events preceding the Russian Revolution. The invasion of Russia in 1912 by Napoleon shook the Russian people to the core. Tsar Alexander I set about the task of organizing a recovery program, in the hope that he could bring about a united effort throughout the Russian Empire. He relaxed many of the restrictions which had been imposed on the Jews when they were confined to the Pale of Settlements in 1772. Special concessions were made to the artisan and professional classes. A determined effort was made to establish Jews in agriculture. Under Alexander I, they were given every encouragement to assimilate themselves into the Russian way of life. Nicholas I succeeded Alexander I in 1825. He was less inclined to favor the Jews because he viewed their rapid inroads into the Russian economy with alarm. His government view his government viewed with great displeasure the determination of the Jews to maintain their separate culture, language, mode of dress, etc. In order to try to assimilate the Jews into Russian society, Nicholas I in 1804 made compulsory for all Jewish people to attend public school. Nicholas thought that if the young Jews could be convinced that they would be welcomed into Russian society, it would go a long way to eliminate misunderstandings. His avowed purpose was to upset the one-sided story of religious persecution which was drilled into their minds from early infancy. The net result of the Russian experiment didn't turn out as expected. Education for non-Jew children was not compulsory. The Jews became best educated segments in Russia. Alexander II followed Nicholas I to the throne of Russia in 1855. Benjamin Disraeli referred to Alexander II as the most benevolent prince that ever ruled over Russia. Alexander devoted his life to improving the conditions of the peasants, poor classes, and the Jews. In 1861, he emancipated 23 million serfs. This unfortunate class had been forced to work on the lands. They were literally slaves. They could be transferred from one owner to another in all sales or leases or land estates. Many Jews who had taken advantage of the compulsory education entered universities. They found themselves severely handicapped after graduation when seeking employment. To correct this injustice, Alexander II ruled that all Jews graduated must be allowed to settle and hold government position in Greater Russia. In 1879, Jewish apothecaries, nurses, midwives, dentists, distillers, and skilled craftsmen were permitted to work and reside anywhere in Russia. But the Jewish revolutionary leaders were determined to continue their movement for popular world revolution. Their terrorist groups committed one outrage after another. They worked to enlist in the support of disgruntled Russian intellectuals and to plant the general idea of violent revolution in the minds of the industrial working population. In 1866, they made their first attempt on the life of Alexander II. They tried to murder him a second time in 1879. In some miraculous manner, both attempts failed. It was then decided a very special effort had to be made to remove Alexander. His benevolent rule was completely unsettling their claim that much needed reforms can only be brought about speedily by revolutionary action. The conspirators hatched their next plot against the life of Alexander II. In the home of the Jews Hesia Helfman, the Tsar, was murdered in 1881. While the revolutionary forces within Russia were trying to embrace the government in every way possible and committing all kinds of outrages, including assassination, the secret powers behind the WRM, from their headquarters in England, Switzerland, and the United States, were trying once again to involve Britain in a war with 161 Russia in 106. In such a war, neither empire could make any appreciable gains. The financial outcome of such a war would be to weaken both empires materially and leave them easier prey for revolutionary action afterwards. In the 19th century October issue, 1881, Goldwin Smith, professor of modern history at Oxford University, wrote, "When I was last in England, we were on the brink of war with Russia, which would have involved the whole empire. The Jewish interest throughout Europe, with the Jewish press of Vienna as its chief organ, are doing its utmost to push us in." The assassination of Russian Little Father in 1881 caused widespread resentment, which was expressed by a spontaneous outbreak of violence against the Jewish population in many parts of Russia. The Russian government passed the May laws. These were harsh laws passed because the Russian officials who sponsored them argued that if the Jews could be satisfied and reconciled by the benevolent policy of Alexander II, then it was obvious that they could be satisfied with nothing le- less than the absolute domination of Russia. Once again, the whole Jewish race were being punished for the sins of a few self appointed revolutionary leaders. On May 23rd, 1882, a Jewish delegation headed by Baron Ginsburg called on the new Tsar Alexander III and officially protested the May laws. The Tsar promised a thorough investigation into the whole matter concerning the conflict between the Jewish and non Jewish factions of the empire's population. On September the 3rd, he issued this statement. For some time, the government has given its attention to the Jews and their problems and their relations to the rest of the inhabitants of the empire with a view to ascertaining the sad conditions of the Christian population brought about by the conduct of the Jews in business matters. During the last 20 years, the Jews have not only possessed themselves of every trade and business in all its branches, but also of a great part of the land by buying or farming it. With few exceptions, they have, as a body, devoted their attention not to enriching or benefiting the country, but to defrauding the Russian people by their wiles. Particularly, they have the poor inhabitants suffered, and this conduct has called forth pro- protests from the people as manifested in acts of violence against the Jews. The government, while on the one hand doing its best to put down these disturbances and to deliver the Jews from oppression and slaughter, on the other hand thought it a matter of urgency and the justice to adopts the stringent measures to put an end to oppression as participated by the Jews on the other inhabitants, and to rid the country of their malpractices, which were, as is well known, the origin cause of the anti Jewish agitations. The May laws have been passed by the government not only as an act of resentment because of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, but also because Russian economists and had been urgently warning the governments that the national economy was in danger of being ruined if measures were not taken to curb the illegal activity of the Jews. The economists pointed out that while the Jews only represented 4.2% of the whole population, they had been able to entrench themselves so well in the Russian economy that the nation was faced with economic disaster. How correct the economists proved to be is shown by the action taken after Baron Ginsburg's deputation failed to have the May laws rescinded. The international bankers imposed economic sanctions against the Russian Empire. They almost reduced the nation to bankruptcy. They exercised an embargo on Russian trade and commerce in 1904 after they involved the Russian Empire in a disastrous war with the Japan. The English banking house Rothschild repudiated its promise for financial aid and tried to render the Russian Empire bankrupt. While New York extended to Japan all the credit asked for. Encyclopedia Britannica, page 76, volume 2, 1947, says this on the May laws. The Russian May laws were the most conspicuous legislation monument achieved by modern anti-Semitism. Their immediate results were a ruinous commercial depression which was felt all over the empire and which profoundly affected the nation credits. The Russian minister was at its wits' end for money. Negotiations for a large loan were entered into the House of Rothschild, and a preliminary contract was signed when the finance minister was informed that unless the persecutions of the Jews were stopped, the great banking house would be compelled to withdraw from the contract. In this way, anti Semitism, which had already so profoundly influenced the domestic policies of Europe, set its mark on the international relations of the powers. For it was the urgent need of the Russian treasury quite as much as the termination of Prince Bismarck's secret treaty of mutual neutrality, which brought about the Franco-Russian alliance. Many Orthodox Jews were worried because of the ruthless terrorism being practiced by their compatriots. They knew that a similar policy was being carried out in France, Germany, and Spain, and Italy. The less radical Jews worried because they feared a continuation of such terrorism would result in such a wave of anti Semitism that it could quite possibly end with the extermination of the Jewish race. Their worst fears were confirmed by a German Jew, Theodor Herzl, who informed them of Karl Ritter's anti-Semitic policy and warned them that it was rapidly being spread throughout Germany. He suggested the organization of a Jewish back to Israel movements on the parts of the Orthodox Jews. This was the beginning of the Zionist movements. After Tsar Alexander III had issued his verdict blaming avaricious Jews as the cause of the empire's unrest and economic ruin, the leaders of the revolutionaries organized the Social Revolutionary Party. An utterly ruthless man named Gershuni was appointed organizer of the terrorist groups. A tailor named Yevno Azev was appointed to organize the fighting sections. The leaders of the Social Revolutionary Party also emphasized the importance of enlisting Gentiles in the movements. Gentiles who passed the tests of to which they were submitted became full members. It was this decision that brought Alexander Ulyanov into the party. Before the revolutionary leaders would admit him into full membership, he was ordered to take part in the plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The attempt on Tsar's life failed. Alexander Yulyavov was arrested. He was tried and condemned to death. His execution caused his younger brother, Vladimir, to dedicate himself to the revolutionary cause. Vladimir rose in power until he became leader of the Bolshevik Party. He assumed the name of Lenin. He ultimately became the dictator of the USSR. Between 1900 and 1906, in addition to causing serious labor trouble, the creating terrible misunderstanding between all levels of Russian society, the Revolutionary Party rubbed the sores of religious bigotry until it developed into a festering boil. This boil was brought to a head by the hot application of wholesale murders and assassinations. The boil burst in the form of revolution of 1905. The officials assassinated by the Social Revolutionaries terrorist sections were Pogolepov, Minister of Education 1801. This assassination was prepared perpetrated, perpetrated to register Jewish resentments against the educational clause in the previously referred to May laws. This clause limited the number of Jews attending states supported schools and universities to a number of ratio to the Jewish population as compared to the whole Russian population. This measure was passed because the state financial schools had been flooded with Jewish students. A group of young Jews who had suffered when the boys became of the educational clause in the May laws of 166, 1882, were given the task of murdering the Minister of Education. They had proved their courage and ability to qualify them for duty with the terrorist section of the Revolutionary Party. The next year, 1902, Sipyagin, Minister of Interior, was assassinated to emphasize Jewish resentments against the May laws, which had reversed the policy of Alexander II and prohibited Jews from living outside the pale of settlements. Jews who had been evicted from their homes in Greater Russia as children under the May laws were chosen to carry out this execution. They made no mistakes. In 1803, Podganovich, governor of Ufa, was assassinated. In 1804, Vishchevel von Plemv was the Russian premier was killed. In 1905, the first full-scale Russian Revolution broke out. The Grand Duke Sergius, uncle of the Tsar, was assassinated on February the 17th. In December 1905, General Dubrasov suppressed the revolutionaries. But in 1906, he was assassinated by the terrorist section. After the Tsar had blamed the Jews for the unsatisfactory state of affairs in Russia, Baron Ginsburg was instructed to bring about the destruction of the Russian Empire. It was agreed that to start the Russo-Japanese War, the Rothschild interests in Europe would pretend to be friendly with Russia. They would finance the war on Russia's behalf, while secretly the Rothschild partners, Loeb and Co. of New York, would finance the Japanese governments. The defeat of Russia was to be made certain by Rothschild's withdrawing of financial aid when it was most needed. Chaos and confusion was to be created within the Russian armed forces in the Far East by sabotaging the lines of transportation and communication across Serbia. This caused both the Russian army and the navy to run short of supplies and reinforcements. Then again, the Russian naval officer bound from the Baltic to Port Arthur in the Far East ordered his ships to fire on a British trawler fleet fishing on the Dover Bank in the North Sea. No logical reason was ever forthcoming to explain this wanton act of cruelty and mass murder against a supposedly friendly power. Public reaction in England was such that war was nearly averted. Because of the incidents, many British naval officers and British merchant officers volunteered their service to Japan. The Japanese government was financed by international loans raised by Jacob Schiff, New York. Schiff was senior partner in Cullen and Co. He was corporated with Sir Ernest Castle's England and the Warburg's Hamburg. Jacob Schiff justified his actions for financing the Japanese in the war against Russia in a letter he wrote to the court's wit, the Tsar's emissary who attended the peace negotiations held at Portsmouth, USA in 1905. Can it be accepted that the influence of the American Jew upon public opinion will be exerted by the advantage of the country which systemically degraded its brethren race? If the governments now being formed should not succeed in assuring safety and equal opportunity throughout the empire to the Jewish population, then indeed the time will have come for the Jews in Russia to quit their inhospitable fatherland. While the problem with which the civilized world will then be faced will be enormous, it will be solved, and you, who are not only a far-seeing statesman but also a great economist, will know best that this fate of Russia and its doom will be then sealed. The hypocrisy of Jacob Schiff can be better appreciated when it is explained that from 1897 he had financed the terrorists in Russia. In 1904 he helped finance the revolution which broke out in Russia in 1905. He also helped to organize on an international basis the financing of the Russian Revolution which broke out early in 1917. And to give him and his associates their first opportunity to put their totalitarian theories into effect. The Russo-Japanese War was fomented by the international bankers in order to create the conditions necessary for the success of a revolutionary effort to overthrow the powers of the Tsars. The plans of the international bankers were upset when the Jewish-led Mensheviks started a revolution independently in Russia in 1905. When the international bankers withheld financial support, the revolution failed right at the moment it appeared to have reached the pinnacle of success. Because the Jewish-dominated Mensheviks acted on their own initiative, the international bankers decided that Lenin would conduct their revolutionary program in Russia from that date onwards. Lenin was born in the city of Simbirsk, located on the banks of the river Volga. He was the son of a government official who had the title of actual state councillor. This title was not inherited, but had been awarded to his father for outstanding services as a school supervisor. Lenin received a university education and was admitted to the practice of law. But he never set himself up in business. Jewish students had persuaded him that it was time to overthrow the power of the privileged classes, and time that the masses ruled their own countries. It was Lenin it was while Lenin was toying with the idea that necessary reforms could be brought about speedily by revolutionary action that his brother was arrested by the police and executed. Lenin was quickly recognized as an intellectual. He was associating with the leaders of the Revolutionary Party when in his early 20s. It had previously stated that the wealthy, direct, influential international moneylenders had helped finance and direct the revolutionary activities within the Pale of Settlements. Lenin wanted to find out all he could about the people who directed the various national revolutionary groups, which were united in the common cause of popular revolution. In 1905, at the age of 25, he went to Switzerland and joined Plekhanov, who had fled there from Russia to escape the fate of Lenin's older brother, Alexander. While in Switzerland, Lenin and Plekhanov, who were Gentiles, joined forces with Vera Zasulich, Leo Dutch, P. Alex Rod, and Julius Senderebum, who were all Jews. They formed a Marxist movement on a worldwide scale, which they named the Group of the Emancipation of Labor. Sederbum was a young man like Lenin. He had earned a reputation in the Pale of Settlements as a ruthless terrorist and accomplished agitator. He changed his name to Martov. He became the leader of the Mensheviks. Lenin ruled the Bolsheviks in Russia. The abortive revolutionary attempt by the Mensheviks in 1905 convinced Lenin that the only way to have a successful revolution was to organize an international planning committee, which would first plan and then direct any agreed upon revolutionary efforts. Lenin brought into being the Comintern as the Central International Revolutionary Planning Committee. The international bankers picked him as their top level agent in Russia. Lenin had made a serious study of the Great French Revolution. When he learned that the secret power which had brought about the French Revolution was still in active operation, he threw in his lot with them. The plan was to let the members of the Comintern think they were the barons, but to influence their thinking so that they furthered the long range plans of the international bankers. If the day came when the revolutionary leaders couldn't be controlled, then they could always be liquidated. Evidence will be given to show how this actually happened. Having decided with his own policy, Lenin returned to Russia with Martov to organize his money raising campaign, which consisted of blackmail, bank robbery, extortion, and other kinds of illegal practices. Lenin argued that it was only logical to take money from the people whose government they plotted to overthrow. He made it a principle of his party that all young people who aspired to membership should, like his older brother Alexander, be tested for physical courage and mental alertness. Lenin insisted that part of every young revolutionary's training should include robbing a bank, blowing up a police station, and liquidating a traitor or spy. Lenin also insisted that the revolutionary leaders in all other countries should organize an underground system. In discussing this matter and writing about it, Lenin declared, everything legal and illegal which furthers the revolutionary movements is justified. He warned, however, that the legal party should always be in control of the illegal. This practice is in force today, particularly in Canada and the United States. Communists who openly acknowledge their membership in the Labour Progressive Party take great care not to get involved in a criminal way with the illegal activities of the Communist Party's underground organization. But the apparatus secretly directs the operations and benefits financially as a result. It is a fact that few of the moneylenders of communism were members of the plur- proletariat. Most of them were well-educated intellectuals. In 1895, they caused a series of strikes. Some of these were successful, turned into riots. Thus, they brought about one of the fundamental principles of revolutionary technique. The develop in a minor disturbance until it becomes a riot, and brought the citizens into actual physical conflict with the police. Lenin, Martov, and a number of other revolutionaries were arrested and sentenced to prison. Lenin finished his prison term in 1897. It is not generally known that in those days, in Russia, political offenders exiled to Siberia were not imprisoned if they had not been convicted of any other criminal offense. Therefore, Lenin took his beautiful young Jewish wife and her Yiddish speaking mother into exile with him. During his term of exile, Lenin drew an allowance of 7 rubles and 40 kopecks a month from the Russian government. This was just about enough money to pay for room and board. Lenin worked as a bookkeeper to earn extra money. It was while in exile that Lenin, Martov, and an accomplice named Potresov decided upon their release to publish a newspaper for the purpose of combining the brains and energy of the entire revolutionary movements, which at that time was broken up into many factions. In February 1900, Lenin finished his exile. He was granted permission to return to Switzerland for a visit. He joined the other revolutionary leaders and the agents of the secret powers. They approved his idea. The Iskra, the spark, was published. The editorial board consisted of the older revolutionary leaders Plekhanov, Zasulich, and Axelrod, with Lenin, Tursov and Marta representing the younger members. Lenin's wife was secretary of the board. Trotsky joined the editorial staff 2 years later. For a while, the paper was actually printed in Munich, Germany. The editorial board met in London. In 1903, it was moved back to Geneva. The copies were smuggled into Russia and other countries by way of the underground system, organized by the Grand Orient Masons. Because the paper was named Iskra, the revolutionaries who subscribed the party line, as defined by the editorial board, became known as the Iskrists. The paper called for the Unification Congress to take place in Brussels in 1903 for the purpose of uniting various Marxist groups. The Russian Social Democrats, Rosa Luxemburg's Polish Socialism Democrats, the Group for the Emancipation of Labor, and the Maximalist Group were represented. Early in August, the Belgian police took action, and the delegates moved over to London en masse. This Congress is of historical importance because during this Congress, the ideological split between the Iskarits, Lenin became leader of the Bolsheviks, or majority party, while Martov became leader of the Mensheviks, or minority group. When the Mensheviks pulled off the abortive revolution in Russia in 1905, Trotsky proved himself a leader of ability. It is difficult for the uninitiated to understand what caused the effort to fold up, because the revolutionaries had control of St. Petersburg from January to December of 1905. They formed the Petersburg Soviets. Lenin and many of his top level revolutionary leaders stayed aloof. They let the Menshevik party handle this revolution. Lenin had been in Geneva consulting with the secret powers when the revolution broke out following the Bloody Sunday tragedy in St. Petersburg in January 1905. He didn't return to Russia until October. The Bloody Sunday tragedy was blamed on the intolerance of the Tsar, 174, but many who investigated the happening found ample evidence to conceive them that the Bloody Sunday incident had been planned by the terrorist group for the purpose of arousing anger and hatred in the heart of the non-Jewish workers against the Tsar. The incident enabled the leaders of the revolutionary movement to enlist the support of thousands of non-Jewish men and women who, until that sad day, had remained loyal to the Tsar and spoken of him as the Little Father. Bloody Sunday is of great historical importance. On January 1905, Russia was at war with Japan. Transportation on the railway across the Russian wastelands to the west, from the west to east, had been broken down. Reinforcements and supplies had failed to get through to the eastern fronts due to sabotage. On January 2nd, the Russian people were shocked with the news that Port Arthur had fallen to the Japanese. They had lost the war against what they considered to be a second class power. The imperial government, in its attempt to gain the favor of the industrial population, adopted the policy of encouraging the formation of legal trade and union. Known revolutionaries had to be barred from membership. One of the most active leaders in the organizing the legal trade union was the Russian Orthodox priest Father Gapon. Liberal reforms obtained by the non-radical citizens didn't please the leaders of the Revolutionary Party, who claimed that necessary reforms could only be brought about by, by revolution. Father Gapon had won so much respect that he was welcomed by the Tsar and his ministers any time he wished to discuss a weighty labor problem. On January 2nd, when the war news swept the empire, organized labor disturbances broke out in St. Petersburg, huge Poltilov works. A strike was called, but because of the general situation, Father Gapon said he would settle the matters and disputes by direct appeal to the Tsar. The idea appealed to the majority of the workers, but the radicals opposed it. However, on Sunday afternoon, January 22nd, 1905, thousands of workmen, accompanied by their wives and children, formed into a procession to accompany Father Gapon to the palace gates. According to the authentic reports, the procession was entirely orderly. Pes- Petitioners carried hastily made banners expressing loyalty to the Little Father at the palace gates. Without the slightest warning, the procession was thrown into utter confusion by a withering volley of rifle and machine gun fire. Hundreds of workers and their families were slaughtered. The square in front of the palace was turned into a space of agonizing chaos. January 2nd, 1905 had been known as the Bloody Sunday ever since. Was Nicholas too responsible? It is a proven fact that he was not in the palace or in the city at the time. It is known that an officer of the guard ordered the troops to fire. It is quite possible he was a cell carrying out the terrorist policy of his superiors. This act was the spark that touched the tinder provided by the revolutionary leaders. The blaze of a full-scale revolution followed. Regardless of who was responsible, tens of thousands of previously loyal industrial workers joined the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and the movement spread to other cities. The Tsar tried to stem the tide of rebellion. Early in February, he ordered an investigation into the St. Petersburg 176 events by the Chidlovsky Commission. In August, he announced provision had been made for the establishment of a democratic representative legislature. This became the Duma. He offered amnesty to all political offenders. It was under this amnesty that Lenin and his Bolshevik leaders returned to Russia in October from Switzerland and other countries abroad. But nothing the Tsar did could stem the tide of revolution. On October 20th, 1905, the Menshevik led all Russian railway unions went on strike. On October 25th, general strikes were effective in Moscow, Smolensk, Kursk, and other cities. On October 26th, the Revolutionary Petersburg Soviet was founded. It assumed the functions of the national government. The Soviet government was dominated by the Menshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, although the Social Revolutionary Party had representation. The first president was Menshevik Zborovisk. He was quickly replaced by Georgy Nozar. He in turn was superseded by Lev Trotsky, who became president on December 9th, 1905. On the 16th of December, a military force arrested Trotsky and 300 members of the Soviet government. There wasn't a single prominent Bolshevik amongst those arrested. This should prove that Lenin was acting for and protected by the secret powers which operate behind the government. The revolution wasn't quite over. On December 20th, a Jew named Pavlus assumed control over a new Soviet executive. He called a general strike in St. Petersburg, and 90,000 workers responded. The next day, 150,000 workers went on strike in Moscow. Open insurrection broke out in Chita, Kansk, and Rostov. On December 30th, the troops and government officials who had remained loyal to the Tsar in some miraculous manner gained control. They put an end to the revolution. Tsar Nicholas II kept his promise. The Duma was formed and an elected legislature established. In 1907, the Fifth Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was held in London. Lenin, with 91 delegates, represented the Bolshevik Party. The Menshevik, led by Martov, had 89 delegates. Rosa Luxemburg led her Polish Social Democrats with 44 delegates. The Jewish Bund, led by Raphael Abramovich, had 55. The Lettish Social Democrats, led by Comrade Herman Danish- Danishevsky, made up the remainder. All told, there were 312 delegates, of which 116 were or had been workers. This Congress had been called for the purpose of holding the post mortem on the abortive Russian Revolution of 1905. Lenin blamed the failure of the revolutionary effort on the lack of cooperation between the Mensheviks and the other leaders. He told the 312 delegates that the Mensheviks had run the whole show and made a mess of things generally. He called for unity of policy and unity of action. He argued that revolutionary action should be planned well in advance and the elements of surprise used to full advantage. Martov hit back at Lenin. He accused him of failing to give the Menshevik revolutionary effort the support he should have done. He accused him particularly of withholding financial assistance. Martov and other Jewish groups, led by Ross, Luxemburg, and Abrahamovich, were annoyed that Lenin had been able to finance the attendance of the largest number of delegates. They accused him of financing the Bolshevik Party by robbery, kidnapping, forgery, and theft. They reprimanded him for refusing to contribute a fair proportion of his ill-gotten gains to the central unifying organization. One big laugh was created when one of the Mensheviks accused Lenin of marrying off one of his top officials to a rich widow in order to enrich his party treasury. Lenin is alleged to have admitted he had done this for the good of the cause. He maintained that the official he had married off to the widow was a fine, strong, healthy specimen of humanity. He thought the widow would agree she had gotten full value for her money. It was at this Congress that Stalin, then a very minor character, became attached to Lenin. The Congress finally agreed to closer cooperation between the leaders of the various revolutionary groups, and decided who should edit their revolutionary newspapers. They put great emphasis upon propaganda. At this Congress, they laid the foundation for the reorganization of their propaganda machine with the understanding that all publications should adopt the same editorial policy, the party line. In 1908, the Bolsheviks started publishing the Proletariat. Lenin, Dubrovsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev were the editors. The Mensheviks published Golos Social-Demokrata, Plekhanov, Axelrod, Martov, Dan, and Martinov Pickle were the editors. All editors were Jewish except Lenin and Plekhanov. Trotsky started a semi-independence publication named Vienna Pravda. In 1909, Lenin won the unconditional support of two Jewish leaders, Zinoviev and Kamenev. They became known as the Troika, and this friendship endured until Lenin's death in 1924. After the Fifth Congress of the Russian Social Democrats Labour Party held in London in 1907, Lenin decided to find out how courageous and trustworthy his new disciple Stalin was. He also wished to convince the leaders of the other revolutionary groups that he was financially independent. To accomplish this dual purpose, he instructed Stalin to rob the Tiflis Bank. Stalin picked as his accomplice an Armenian man, Petroyan, who afterwards changed his name to Kamo. They discovered the bank was going to transfer a large sum of money from one place to another by public conveyance. They waylaid the conveyance. Petroyan tossed a bomb. Everything and everyone in the conveyance was blown to smithereens except the strong box containing the cash 250,000 rubles. 30 people lost their lives. The loot was turned over to Lenin. Stalin had proved himself as a potential leader. The Bolsheviks encountered difficulty using the stolen rubles for party purposes because most of the currency consisted of 500 ruble notes. Lenin conceived the idea of distributing the 500 ruble notes among trustworthy Bolsheviks in various countries. They were instructed to get rid of as much of the money as they could on a given day. The directive was carried out, but two of the Lenin's 180 agents fell foul of the police during the transaction. One was Olga Ravich, who afterwards married Zinoviev, Lenin's great friend. The other was Mayor Wayash, whose real name was Finklenstein. He afterwards changed his name again to Maxim Litvinov. He became known throughout the world as Stalin's Commissioner of Foreign Affairs from 1930 to 1939. After the revolution of 1905 had ended, Tsar Nicholas II set about making any radical reforms. He planned turning the Russian absolute monarchy into a limited monarchy, such as is enjoyed by the British people. After the Duma began to function, the premier, Peter Arkadьevich Stolypin, became a great reformer. He dominated Russian politics and drafted the Stolypin Constitution, which guaranteed civil rights to peasants who were about 85% of the entire Russian population. His land reforms granted financial assistance to the peasants so they could purchase their own farms. His idea was that the logical way to defeat those who advocated for the communal way of life was to encourage individual ownership. But the revolutionary leaders wanted to usurp political and economic power. They were not the least bit satisfied with the reforms. In 1906, a terrorist group attempted to assassinate Stolypin. They destroyed his home with a bomb. Several more plots were hatched to do away with the most progressive premier the Russians could have hoped to have. On a dark September night in 1911, the great 181 emancipator was shot to death in cold blood while attending the gala performance at the Kiev Theater. The assassin was a Jewish lawyer named Mordecai Pogrov. In 1907, the international bankers organized the Wall Street panic in order to reimburse themselves the money spent in connection with the Russian wars and revolutions. They were also financing the preliminary stages of the Chinese Revolution, which broke out in 1911. Many of the Stolypin's proposed reforms were carried out after his death. In 1912, an industrial insurance law gave all industrial workmen compensation for sickness and injury to the extent of two-thirds of their regular pay for sickness and three-fourths for accidents. Newspapers of the revolutionary parties were given legal status for the first time since they had been printed. Public schools were expanded. The election laws were revised in order to give more representative governments. In 1913, the government of Tsar of Russia granted a general amnesty for all political prisoners. Admittedly, they were released from prison. Immediately they were released from prison, they began the plots with renewed energy to overthrow the Russian government. Terrorists advocated the liquidation of the royal family, but the reforms had appealed to the vast majority of the Russian people. The revolution in Russia looked like a dead issue for the time being. Those who directed the world revolutionary movement decided they would give Russia a rest for the time being. They concentrated their efforts in other countries. Portugal and Spain came in for attention. Because of the red fog created by communist propaganda and the organized campaign of La Famille carried out on in Russia, as it had been carried on in France and England prior to those revolutions, it is difficult for the average person to believe that the Russian czars and nobles were anything else than big bearded monsters who enslaved the peasants, raped their young women, and speared babies on the points of their swords, while galloping through villages on horseback in order to prove that the last of the czars was a reformer. We will quote Bertram Wolf, because Bertram Wolf was anti-czarist and pro-revolutionary. Wolf says on page 360 of his book, Three Who Made a Revolution. Between 1907 and 1914, under Stolypin's land reforms, 2 million peasants and their families were seceded from the village mere and became individual proprietors. All through the war, 1914-1917, the movement continued so that by January 1st, 1916, 6,002,000 peasant families out of the approximately 16 million who had become eligible had made application for separation. Lenin saw the matter as a race with time between Stolypin's reforms and the next revolutionary upheaval. Should the upheaval be postponed for a couple of decades, the new land measures would transform the countryside so it would no longer be a revolutionary force. How near Lenin became to the being right is proved by the fact that in 1917, when he called upon the peasants to take the land they already owned, more than three-fourths of it. They already owned more than three-fourths of it. It is unfortunately true that Rasputin did exert an evil influence upon certain men and women of the Russian imperial courts. I know from ladies attached to the courts at that time that Rasputin exercised a tremendous influence over the empress because her young son suffered from hemophilia, and Rasputin was the only man who could stop the bleeding. Rasputin definitely had mesmeric powers which are not uncommon among certain of the Russian people. He seemed able to place the empress under his influence not as a lover, but for the purpose of making her force the Tsar to do what Rasputin decided he wanted to do. It is not an exaggeration to say that Rasputin became the power 183 he exerted on the Tsar through the Queen, virtually ruled Russia to the dismay of the Russian people. It is also true that Rasputin introduced into court circles men and women who practiced the pagan rites, which were secretly carried on in the Palais Royal prior to the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. These ritual orgies were based on the ridiculous assumption that people could not be saved until they had plumbed the depths of the degradation in sin. He introduced sub-varieties rights into the royal household, and they obtained information that enabled their masters to blackmail many influential people into doing their bidding. Rasputin was undoubtedly of the Illuminati and synagogue of Satan.